Good afternoon, everyone. I didn't even have to ask for quiet. You just got quiet. That's so nice. It is such a pleasure to thank you for being here with us this afternoon. My name is Jennifer Withrow. I'm the Deputy Chief Curator here at McMichael. I will begin with a land acknowledgement. The McMichael Canadian Art Collection is located on the traditional lands of the Ojibwe, Anishinaabe, and Huron-Wendat people. It is uniquely situated along the Carrying Place Trail, which you can see, well, we have the blinds down. You could see.
It's right out yonder.
It's right out yonder, which historically provided an integral connection between Lake Simcoe, Georgian Bay region, and the Lake Ontario lakeshore down in Toronto. As an institution, the McMichael recognizes the importance of acknowledging the original territories of the Ojibwe, Anishinaabe, and the Huron-Wendat people. I hope some of you have had the chance to go down and see the exhibition that is the impetus for this gathering. It may, at first blush, seem a little bit different from the McMichael, the offerings that you're used to seeing at McMichael, but I've been thinking about it, and it really isn't, because here at McMichael, we make it our business to foreground the work of Canadian artists who are grappling with the big questions of our time. And I can hardly think of a better example of that than John Scott. This exhibition and this project with John O'Brien has been under development for 7 years, I think now. And in that 7 years, COVID-19 happened, so the project was rescheduled once or twice. It has landed in a moment that, for better or for worse, John Scott's work and the questions he was asking us to think about feel more urgent than ever. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from John O'Brien, our guest curator, in conversation with someone I know that many of you already know, Sarah Milroy, our chief curator and executive director. Before I introduce them, I just want to remind you all, and well, it's a pleasure actually to thank the people who help us do the best that we can and make our exhibitions the best that they can be. I have a list of our supporters here. We have Hatch, a company that has supported many of our endeavors and allows us to kind of reach high and be ambitious in all that we do. David Angelo, David Clare, Jane and Jeff Cowan, Kiki and Ian Delaney, Sue Edwards and Mike Evans, Lauren Gertner and Emily Masuda, Brian and Susan Leahy, the Nicholas Mativier Gallery, Marnie Schreiber and Karen Schreiber, Joyce and Fred Siemens. So thank you very much for linking arms with us to support this exhibition. I will let Sarah introduce John O'Brien, and I will introduce Sarah. Many of you know her already. She has been our chief curator since 2018, and our executive director and chief curator since about this time last year. And in that time, she has curated dozens of exhibitions, many landmark projects and award-winning exhibitions. And I think we've published, in those 7 years, I think we've published almost 30 books. This might be the 29th or 30th. Here, this one. This just arrived last week, hot off the presses, and John O'Brien wrote the main essay for this book, and he has agreed to sign books after this talk, so thank you very much, John. I hope you will think about your Christmas giving list and have a book signed for your loved ones or for yourselves. I will hand it over to Sarah Milroy, who will introduce John O'Brien. Oh, and I forgot to say, sorry, we're going to do a Q&A afterwards. So during the talk, if you're thinking about questions, please hang on to them, don't forget them, and we'll do a Q&A at the end. Take it away, Sarah.
Thank you, Jen. That's terrific. Thank you all for being here. It may not seem like the most obvious Yuletide gift, John Scott Firestorm, but one of the things we're going to talk about today is that this is the historical moment we're in. The show has landed at an amazing time in Western history, and there is this incredible soulfulness about the work that really actually is quite a comfort. I didn't anticipate the extent to which that would be the case looking at the work in slide form or in scans, but when you're actually with the touch in the work, it's really rather reassuring in a funny way. So John Scott, was a legendary figure in Toronto art. He was a true artist. He was deeply respected, taught art at OCAD, had countless followers and people, admirers, never mimics, because he always encouraged people to make their own path. Born in Windsor, Ontario, May 11th, he missed May Day, that would have made more sense, in 1950, and every inch a Cold War baby, and I think you can see the anxiety of that, core part of his identity, as well as his working class identity that we'll be talking about today. He died a couple of years ago, not quite 2 years ago, which was, of course, makes this gathering and this exhibition very bittersweet, but he knew the show was coming. He knew that he had the best possible curator for the show, someone who has grappled with notions of nuclear threat and militarism and America's role in the arms race and so on for generations. And of course, John's vision seems more urgent now than it ever has been. So John O'Brien, just to tell you a little bit about my beloved colleague to my left, art historian, writer, and curator based in British Columbia. He was at UBC teaching generation upon generation, if I may, of emerging curators, writers, eminence grise. I think we've got there, right, John? We've kind of, eventually. Now, not so much in Vancouver as he is on Main Island with his beloved Helen, who is here somewhere in the audience, close by, I hope. Which is one of the beautiful Gulf Islands at the bottom of the Strait of Juan de Fuca in BC. John's background includes high finance, as well as a period of time when he was very active writing poetry before getting involved with the visual arts and then becoming, as I say, one of the most preeminent art historians in the country, writing on such artists as Matisse, importantly, and Canadian artists, equally importantly, such as James Wilson Maurice, David Milne and the Group of Seven. He co-edited a wonderful anthology called Beyond Wilderness. If you want to just Google that puppy up on Amazon or whatever, it was a paradigm shifter in the study of Canadian art because it was one of the first publications to really grapple with Indigenous concepts of land and territory versus settler concepts of land, as exemplified in the works of the Group of Seven, and really shifted the way we talk about landscapes. So that book is quite precious to us here at the McMichael. And then he's also edited the collected writings of Clement Greenberg, no lightweight there, and Camera Atomica, 2015, which is post-war nuclear photography, the exhibition Bombhead at the Vancouver Art Gallery in 2018. And that's where John and I found ourselves just shortly before I came to the McMichael, standing in front of this work here, deciding that we really must do a John Scott show at the McMichael, because what could be more Canadian than someone looking critically in this kind of one-way mirror that is our border, looking at the U.S. in this critical way, but being utterly invisible in return. So it is kind of a quintessential Canadian position that we have here in this country that's really kind of unlike any other nation's relationship to the U.S. He has also won the Takor Award in Human Rights and Peace Studies at Simon Fraser University, which is often referred to as the Gandhi Prize. So many honors and accolades, all of them so richly deserved. And it's just been a total delight. John's been in and around us for probably a week or so now as we've put the final touches on the show and done a few small forays. We had a lovely party here in the middle of a snowstorm on Thursday night where people, braved the elements to come and be with us. It was a great gathering, and it's just a total pleasure to have you here.
It's a great pleasure for me to be here. Sarah and I have known each other for quite a long time. I've always read her material in the Globe and Mail, followed Canadian art, and then followed the work since, including all the work in London that was so important. So this is, a terrific pleasure to be here at the McMichael, and I should say to be working with the staff at the McMichael, who to a person has been personable and wonderful and efficient and helpful and without panic of any kind, and that's a glorious thing.
We're paddling underwater, This show, I'm just going to move your mic slightly closer to you in case it makes it easier for people to hear you.
Okay.
Just to get you a bit more on mic.
All right.
This was by far, I think, the hardest show, Jen, that we've ever mounted physically here, because those great big monster drawings that are framed in the end of the day, first we thought it was a dark moment and we thought we couldn't fit them in the building. And that went on for quite a while. And then we realized through Lorena Giordana, who's not here today, but who's the head of tech services, devised a way to get them in through a back security door at the back of the building and up and over the ramp that way and into the building. So it would have, if those frames had been like more than a quarter inch larger, they wouldn't have fit in. But yeah, now we know. Absolutely the biggest thing we can get in the building are these frame drawings by John Scott.
And those works, just to interrupt, those are works, those huge ones that we've managed to get in, or that McMichael managed to get in, were executed by John Scott on the floor of his studio, always an unruly place, as John was himself in life as well as in art. And what he would do is lay out paper of just about any kind. It certainly wasn't expensive paper. Cover it with Varsol, have all sorts of material to hand, and with brush and hand, push the paint around to get that emanating darkness that he produces in those works, with a kind of virtuosic messiness. And when you're working on huge works and they're laid out in that way, you wonder just how he fits all the pieces together. But he had a notion of what he was doing and found a way to execute it. And as people who watched him doing this said, that he worked fiercely while doing it, and as a kind of fierce mark-making that he's engaged in. And then it would have to dry for quite a long time, and he'd pin it up any which way on the wall, and that was the work of art. Not many people have worked that way. Between Your Eyes, which is the first one you see when you go in, and I'm assuming that just about everybody's seen the show, is the size of Guernica. And Guernica is one of the largest things that Picasso ever did. It's also a war painting. It also cares about war from the air, because that's what's happening in the Basque town. It's precisely what interests John Scott.
Interesting. So John, take us back to John Scott's beginnings, how he grew up, how he got sensitized to his subject matter.
Yeah. John Scott was born in 1949, which was the first official year of the Cold War. That was when the Soviet Union acquired nuclear weapons. He was born working class in Windsor to Scottish parents. Father was a factory worker, but a musician as well. So the little film called Born Near the USA that we're showing on an old Sony television set to give it the right sort of ambience shows his father playing his highly autobiographical Born Near the USA. His mother was a nurse's aide who got tuberculosis. His father died young of emphysema, and John left school between grade 9 and 10. Not sure which, grade 9 or 10, or in between, and went and started to do factory work. And that was where he developed many of his views about social justice. He was introduced through the union movement to Marx. Not that he was a card-carrying Marxist, but his Marxification, his understanding of issues of social justice developed out of that, and perhaps with conversations with his father. And he was, of course, across from Detroit, across from Motor City, across from Motown, across from Ford and General Motors, and from who were manufacturing combat vehicles and component parts for atomic bombs, which is sometimes forgotten when one thinks about Detroit.
So, yes, little hearts, no escape.
So a lot of people think this is a B-52 bomber when they see it. It's actually a B-29, and a B-29 was a plane that was piloted by Paul Tibbets that dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. And so John has given us that, along with the mushroom cloud, and then enormous amounts of scratched writing on the surface of the paper, which does two things. It reminds us that we're actually not looking at that event. We're looking at a representation of it, as if we didn't know, but nevertheless, that helps with that. And he also, the language helps us to sort of focus back and forth on what we're looking at. Dear hearts, there's little hearts, there's no escape. difficult motion. So the plane is tilted like this, and Tibbets had to practice and practice and practice in Utah at a base to get the right angle to drop the atomic bomb so that his own plane wasn't blown apart. So difficult angle. So Scott knew these things. Scott understood the nuclear world he inhabited. He understood the instruments of the Cold War, and he understood very keenly those who were vulnerable.
Mm-hmm. And even though he dropped out of school in grade 9, I think he was a lifelong autodidact and reading about physics and surveillance technology.
I'm sorry, I'm speaking to them, and I should be speaking to you. Gosh, forgive me.
I can share.
Forgive me.
I can share.
I mean, after all, she's my comrade in arms.
So the other thing that's interesting about this drawing is the phrase anthropomorphized self-portrait. And maybe you could talk a little bit about John's feelings about masculinity here. This might be the segue.
Well, Scott recognized that he was living in a world of hypermasculinity, and that Detroit Windsor was sort of a nexus of that hypermasculinity. It produced muscle cars, it produced dangerous planes, and that one part of machines, evil machines, engines of history, he called them, and one part of him was fascinated by that. There was a boy in him that loved that material, made him want to draw it. He was also, at the same time, horrified by what those machines could do. And so at the core of his work are death-dealing machines and those who are vulnerable to them.
Mm-hmm. And I think, there's sort of two bodies of work in the show. One are these, we're going to look at them in a minute, but one are these, the engines of history, and then portraiture, the human figure, which was just an ongoing fascination of his. And I think, a work like this, I think you've talked about this work to me in relation to the history of art. That's also a good place to go in this conversation. If you could just take us there.
Yeah, I mean, work like this makes me think of Goya. Others who were representing war and the violence of war. It makes me think of some of Nancy Sparrow's work or Leon Golub's work more recently in our own time. And when Sarah and I were standing in the Vancouver Art Gallery looking at that initial piece, I'd quarantined it off from 5 works by Nancy Sparrow in which she had women being exploded by atomic bombs. Nancy Sparrow was a formidably important figure, not nearly enough recognized in my view these days. Mm-hmm. And so Scott and she would have been extremely sympathetic to one another's work had they known one another.
It's interesting because one of Goya's most famous images of war is of the bodies being hung in the trees.
Yeah, that's the Goya.
Which is kind of remembered there. And then the bunny people. There are many bunny people.
And then the bunny people.
Iconography is kind of these horrifying machines of destruction, and then the victims.
And so often he pictured the victims or those who were vulnerable as adorned with rabbit ears. But not always the victims. I think looking at this, you might agree that the figure who is up above the lower figure is in fact rather a menacing-looking figure wearing rabbit ears. So not always vulnerable. And again, that keeps us honest in looking at the work. And here's the between the eyes. So this is the sort of thing that would fascinate Scott. This, at the time, this was the premier spy plane operated by the United States Air Force from 1969 to 1989 for 20 years. To this day, it is still the fastest plane that has ever been made, a piloted plane. And it was so fast that if rockets and missiles were aimed at it by the opposing side as it was doing its aerial reconnaissance, it could just speed up a little bit and outrun them.
So it says speed Mach 3000 there.
Yes. And then so John has put his own eyes on either side of this plane. So we are all under surveillance. John Scott was prescient about where we were going. He recognized, and by the time we got to AI, if we show the Dark Commander, we'll have something to say about this, but he understood the degree to which we were in a surveillance society.
You could see that coming.
And watched it. He could see it coming.
And also really, I think, saw the U.S. at that time as kind of a rogue nation. Not just the U.S., of course, because Canada's very implicated in nuclear arms proliferation as well. And maybe we should talk about that. It's interesting, if you walk into John Scott, if you're arriving from the front of the museum, you'll go past a photograph by Ed Bertinsky of the uranium tailings at Elliott Lake in Northern Ontario, which is one of the main sites for uranium extraction. John has made a career over the past 30 years of digging out exactly how involved Canada is in nuclear proliferation.
Yeah. I mean, Canada's deeply complicit. We think of ourselves as being a peace-loving nation, and I wish it were so. And part of that comes from Lester Pearson winning the Nobel Peace Prize.
It's been a long time since then, though.
It's been a while. But from the very beginning, we were part of the Manhattan Project that developed the bomb during the Second World War. The first nuclear reactor built outside the United States was in Chalk River, Ontario, and that nuclear reactor was not for peaceful purposes, it was to make plutonium for nuclear weapons. Canada's decided not to be a nuclear nation and to have those, but it became the largest supplier of, the largest miner of uranium in the world, much of which went for sales to the United Kingdom, to Europe, and to the United States for nuclear programs. It's now Kazakhstan. And Canada allowed cruise missile testing. We became like Area 51 in the United States, like the Nevada test site. We were used for testing for cruise missiles. And as we all remember, and it's important to remember because we're still in this world only to a greater degree, that the cruise missile, when it was developed, could, from 3,000 miles away, target something within a few meters because of computerization.
Yeah. Between us and the front row.
It could go right in the front row here, from 3,000 miles away, with a nuclear weapon warhead that was the size of the one that was dropped on Nagasaki. And so Canada's been deeply implicated. We all are, and we are all under threat, as every other place in the world is. And Scott recognized that living in Windsor across the river from Detroit wasn't going to protect him from anything, or anybody from anything.
Those lines don't matter when we're talking about radiation. Yeah, exactly. The most evil vehicle. I mean, I think talk to me a little bit about the smudging, what that does for the image for you. You and I haven't had a chance to talk about that, but
Well, this is so much a part of his big work. This is a work that's now in the collection of Nicolas Métavier, who was his last dealer. And you notice that the paper is uneven. It's just been cut as a piece of paper he found. It's snipped up at the sides there. And he would have, on this piece of paper, put a petroleum distillate. He used Varsol, but there are other ones.
This is all, by the way, very bad stuff to inhale.
It's not good stuff to inhale.
Not good stuff to inhale.
John put a lot of things into his body that weren't very healthy, and that's one of them. Pushing this around, so he pushed it all over the paper, and then he would have had his various kinds of paint, mostly black. But he used color. When he used color, he didn't use it very often. He used it to great effect. Here, just a bit of red. And then he would have had an outline of this particular fighter bomber, because that's what we're looking at, a fighter bomber, outlined on the paper. He'd do that, perhaps before he put the Varsol on. And then he'd start putting his paint and pushing it around with brush and in other ways to get this. And the sort of scumbling that you get in here, or the sort of throwing of paint as it splashes around, is reminiscent a little bit of Jackson Pollock. Jackson Pollock was when Jackson Pollock did his works, they were highly choreographed. People think he just threw paint. He didn't. He had big canvases. He also painted on the floor, and he had a stick, and he moved it in a choreographed fashion with different paints. This is also choreographed in a messier way than Pollock, but with, to my mind, an equal kind of impact.
Mm-hmm. And I think that blurring, to me, it suggests gives you this nightmarish sense of velocity, which is kind of accentuated by having the nose of it have these offshoots around it. but also sort of something unthinkable. You know, it's like you can't find the edges of it. You can't define what it is. For me,
Yeah.
you know, I find it enhances the kind of sense
Like a
of
bad dream
menace.
moving through space.
Yeah, yeah. And then sometimes the rockets are sublime, like this one heading into outer space.
And of course, just the word Icarus at the top tells you what he thinks is going to happen. It's going to fall from the sky.
But an unusual work, this one, in that it has so much color in it. And,
Yes. And
you know,
it's
I think you know, you're seeing here this kind of, you know, he's horrified by it, but also kind of seduced by it. And I had some concerns about children walking into this show. You know, we have a lot of school kids here, 40,000 or so a year, and suddenly we realized as the kids started coming through at the end of last week, like the little boys with the rockets and the planes and the tanks. And so I was fascinated by it, and also really connecting with the kind of roughness of the graphic touch and everything that's really speaking to them. But you know, this is where he's kind of connecting to his feelings, maybe perhaps in childhood, of being fascinated by these machines. You know, leaping up into the sky. Far more menacing. Second Strike. So perhaps you could talk to us about that title.
It was 1983 that Canadians got up in arms and protests broke out all over the country saying, "Refuse the cruise." This dates from 1983. It's the time of testing. The image we're seeing a cruise missile flying low, as cruise missiles do, through valley bottoms or close to the ground. It could be any mountain range. It could be the Rockies. It could be the Urals in the Soviet Union. It could be the Alps in Europe. We see it flying, and then we start to read some of what he said on the top. So it says, second strike. So this is not a first strike. There has already been an atomic bomb or other cruise missiles exploded, and this is in response to the first strike, right? So, and this is how the world dies. The United States or the Soviet Union or somebody bombs or attacks the other, and the moment that happens, it lets off all its nuclear weapons, and nuclear winter ensues. And this danger is no less now than it was at the height of the Cold War. We're still in the Cold War. And so he says particles up there, but the first strike was approximately half an hour previously. And so here he's got his cruise missile moving through the mountains.
And I think the notes help us to really understand how deeply he's imagining these realities too.
He's feeling them deeply. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And in one sense, I think of J.G. Ballard. J.G. Ballard has been a figure of fascination for me. And he trained to be an RAF pilot in Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan. And because he was convinced there was going to be nuclear war, he wanted to be a nuclear pilot with a front row seat on Armageddon. If it was going to go, he wanted a front row seat. And in fact, he never succeeded in flying a plane properly. And it was in Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan that he started to write science fiction. Mm-hmm. And I've got reams of material on this, but I can't get his logs for that period. The Department of Defense has lost everything, so the book I want to write will never be written on J.G. Ballard. So you know that it's something that obsesses me.
And John was very interested in science fiction too.
Hugely. He started off wanting to write science fiction.
Yeah. Oh, the Trans Am Apocalypse. We just had the maquette for the Trans Am Apocalypse. Some of you may have seen this, the actual car, which is painted black and then inscribed with passages from the Book of Revelations. This is the little model for it, but we couldn't fit the Trans Am Apocalypse in our building. It doesn't. You see, after we renovate the McMichael, we'll be able to bring the Trans Am Apocalypse here. It's in the collection, I think, of the Art Gallery of Ontario, isn't it?
It's Art Gallery of Ontario. Mm-hmm. Also, the National Gallery has one as well.
Oh wow! Okay, so I didn't realize there was another one at the agency.
And so when he came back from Beirut, because he'd gone, he thought somebody who was a war artist. He was a war artist. He didn't call himself that, but others did. Should see a war zone, and the civil war in Lebanon was the hottest war
Conflict,
at that particular time. Horrific now. And so he went there. It was controversial to go. And that was 1983. And in 1988, so some years afterwards, 87, he made this. And in 88, the big version. For the big version, he bought a Trans Am Firebird, Pontiac Trans Am Firebird from 1981, which is sort of the muscle car, I'm told, by people who know these things. It's the car that if you are working in a 7-Eleven and it comes up to your front gate, you want to close all the gates quickly. It means trouble.
Hide under the desk.
Yeah. So he's interested not just in military vehicles of destruction, but also civil ones. And so he took that car, bought it for $800. It still worked, still drove, painted it matte black, and with a sharp nail, scratched the whole book of Revelations from word for word, beginning to end, on the surface of it. The book of Revelations is the grimmest and most prophetic and difficult of the New Testament books. John Scott was fascinated by that. Then he hung a pair of fuzzy blue dice on the rearview mirror.
He wanted a front row seat too, perhaps. Yeah. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about this wonderful wall of drawings and your decision to exhibit the works in this way, and perhaps John's graphomania, a wonderful word that you've used with us.
I've been very pleased with the way this worked out, and the people have responded to it well. There are about 60 works on this wall. They're all held on by magnets or in some other way that's ephemeral and no glass over the works, because I wanted that direct feeling and also the sense of the extent of his work. He was highly prolific. And no matter how prolific he was, there's always a difference from one work to the other. There's always the faces are individual. Kenneth Baker, who writing an art forum in about 1983 or 1984, commented on Scott's work. He'd seen a show of his in London, England, and was really taken by the degree, like Basquiat, that he had the touch that never seemed inauthentic or false. It was felt touch. And I thought that was a very astute comment. And so that's why we have done all this. And of course, there's some humor in Scott as well. If I can just, in this one here, you've got a figure holding up a stealth bomber, or a picture of one. And then the tank that's beside it has you've got the wheels on the bottom that are round, and then you've got, the tank is full of eyes that are all up this. And so it's a tank of eyes going along, and a stealth bomber that doesn't work, but a representation. It's called Damn. So on the one hand, it's slightly humorous, and it's certainly slightly menacing as well.
And it's that really strange sort of frisson between something that's kind of charming and makes you feel it's endearing in a way, and yet he's looking, the little black and white drawing just to the right of it.
Yes, that's.
Yet
we talked about this before. And
it's kind of adorable, but it's a tank, So he's always sort of riding that rail between the subject matter being so horrific and menacing, but the way in which it's executed being so incredibly full of a human touch and sort of vulnerability. Some more of our favorites here. That was. Yeah, occasionally he got interested. This figure down here looks like a goalie.
Yes, that is a goalie.
Mm-hmm. He also made some boxers, too. He made some works that have, like, Mike Tyson type of boxers, sometimes with bunny ears, just to mix it up.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's what was his, kind of the Napoleon works, too, that kind of critique of masculinity that's like, what drives that kind of hyper-masculine, violent presentation? And it is a smallness. There's a bunny inside the monsters, I think, was John Scott. And so, all these tough guys that show up in the work in different ways are really also vulnerable.
Yeah, like the astronaut.
This guy with the little bunny head inside all of his armature. Are you hearing us, Donald Trump? Just saying. We see you. Yeah, remarkable. I mean, again, this is a perfect example of how various, these are all, these two portraits here in the middle. The figure with the A nose is one of my personal favorites. Yeah. We just wanted to go into this one again.
Yeah.
Extraordinary. This idea of this, the tank with all the eyes in it, this idea of a kind of lumbering surveillance, like always. Maybe you could talk to us about the conquering worm, which is one of the, we don't have a slide
Do we
of
have
it.
a photograph of the
We don't, but you'll find it in the show. It's this kind of, well, how do we describe this? It's like a,
it looks like a gigantic worm covered in pewter.
Yeah.
Metallic pewter.
Kind of nailed onto the surface of it. It's very rustic.
With a khaki coloring on it and red lights. The conqueror worm was, he did some drawings of it, and there are one or two in the show.
Mm-hmm.
But he conceived of it as a juggernaut, something that just was unstoppable. So it just would move across the countryside and in through cities and not be stoppable.
Bringing death and destruction.
Bringing death and destruction. And yet you also want to pat it on the head a bit.
Yeah,
so,
it's got this scythe attached to the side of it. So it's kind of like the Grim Reaper kind of turned into a giant, like worm-like creature. But of course, I've always thought the conquering worm, too, is almost like an Elizabethan kind of title that suggests death, right? Because we all are worm food in the end.
Very good.
And so I think it's about,
you're right.
I think it's about like making fun of death in a funny way, that piece. It's very ungainly and kind of adorable, even though it's really creepy. So,
And in the book, there's a photograph of Scott leaning on it while speaking to students.
Like his pet.
I love that photograph.
So, John's working class background, maybe we should circle back to that.
Yeah.
Because born near the USA, I mean, really a good thing for people if you can find a moment to listen to the whole little film that's on the TV set. It tells you a lot about John's background and his orientation. But,
And he did watercolors like these, or I think these are the gouache, not watercolor. But he did on all much the same size sheets. He drew and drew and drew and made a film called Born Near the USA that is highly autobiographical because we see his, as I mentioned earlier, his father playing the piano in it. We see his mother working as a nurse's aide, and we see many other things besides. And we see, here's capital at work. This is, this is factory work, the regimentation of everyday life, which was a matter of nothing was more, that was complete anathema to everything that John thought was important in the world. Regimentation of life was death for him. And there's actually one of these in here that says, there's a head of a man and it says death on it. And there's another one that points to Canada, which could be death for Canada too, from things nuclear or from capital.
So we have the workers outside the factory, and then we also have who is benefiting from this kind of monopoly figure type, top-hatted individual with his strange eyes, and of course the bunny people behind. I was speaking with one of our guests here today before we came up here, and he said John was one of the meek. This idea of the meek, and because he was the most, for all the ferocity of his touch, people in the room who knew him will know that he was like sweet-natured, like nobody's business. And of course, that's why all the women were crazy about him too. But, very, very intelligent, very, very sensitive, sweet natured to speak to, very genuine, but, very unassuming. This idea of this kind of, there's the figure of finance with these kind of, the meek. Really, I thought it was an interesting word to use in relation to John.
It is. Mm-hmm. It is. I've spoken in the last few days to a dozen people who knew him really well, which I did not. And it's been a great privilege to hear their stories and also just to see how much he was loved.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So this is one of the signal works in the show, I think, because it's really kind of where we find ourselves right now with everyone. We're the holidays are coming, and we're sort of watching the evening news. Trump has won the election. We're in for something. We don't really know what it is. The war in the Middle East is raging. Russia and Ukraine are coming to a different place. The whole geopolitics is shifting. And so to me, this is kind of feels like a little bit what it feels like right now to be a conscientious observer of what's happening in the world. It's just, the human being, but then in the brain is all this.
And what's so interesting about...
I don't mean to depress you all, but,
yeah. Well, another
it's
interesting...
kind of, there's a comfort in looking at John Scott right now, because it's like, this is actually where we are. Yeah. And he expresses it so humanely.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And in a work like this, which was done in the 90s, he understood where warfare was going. Increasingly, what nations who are engaged in warfare want to do is to take soldiers out of the field and to put robots inside using AI. And so here is a figure in which the prosthetics are in the eye and on the head, which are all sort of automatic. And this is a representation of that. I don't know whether John knew this or not, but I know it, so I'm going to tell you. But it's all highly, the notion of taking soldiers out of the field to keep them alive is entirely bogus, because then you've got all the vulnerable figures that are being killed by more and more lethal weapons. But the Chinese, for instance, just to give you bad dreams tonight, have taken a very large number of decommissioned fighter planes and equipped them with AI and with nuclear weapons. So these are flying drones that can drop nuclear weapons. And there are dozens of them. And you're not going to get all of them, shoot all of them down, and if you do, they're still going to explode. But it's just there's a fleet of actually decommissioned planes ready to fly with nuclear weapons.
Operated by AI.
And it's the sort of thing that John, if he'd known about it, would have made a series of drawings and that somehow let us know about that, or the feeling of that, or the danger of it, while still not being quite as horrible as I've been in telling it.
Somehow. I wonder what he would have been drawing right now these days.
I'd love to know.
Yeah.
I'd love to know.
This is one of my personal favorites. It's the U.S. Capitol with these. We didn't have drones. I don't think that. He might have known of prototypes in 1995 and would have seen how important those would become.
Yeah.
Again, the eyes, the surveillance. And this was one of the last works that he made, I understand, before he died. So
the last one in the exhibition from 2015. He did do some works afterward, but that's the last one in the exhibition. And he, I don't know whether you can see at the back, but this says resist, and the bunny figure, the vulnerable bunny figure, it looks a little uncertain about where they stand on resisting. But in small letters, just to the left of the head or to the right of the head where you are, it says why. So it is, that tension that so many of us feel between activism and apathy. That A on the face of the earlier figure, activism and apathy, and the desire to do something, but not always knowing how.
Yeah, to face that choice between trying to fight or trying to get the most joy out of life that you can, and its immediacy. Because is it effective to resist? So he's asking that question here. It's an amazing drawing. It's at the very end of the book. Maybe you should talk a little bit about the book, because there's some wonderful things in there.
When Sarah asked me to do the show, I made it a condition, although it wasn't. I don't think I was that harsh.
I don't think you had to.
But I said, I'd really, yes, but I'd really like to see a substantial book to go with it, because I didn't think that John Scott had been adequately served. He'd been wonderfully well served by critical writing. A lot of the people writing about Scott have been highly perceptive, and he was perceptive himself. But there hadn't been publications that gave him his due by
the
showing
gravitas that he was due to.
By showing a large amount of his work. So every work in the exhibition is in that book. And in addition to that, we worked very hard on doing a chronology that updates what chronologies there were, It's pro tem, it's provisional, because John loved story, but he didn't care much about fact. And so you've got all sorts of contradictory information. So it's, anybody who has a better version of what happened can please let me know for the second, third, and fourth edition.
Exactly.
And then the two writers writing are, there are two shorter essays in the book. There's Sarah's wonderful introduction to it, and then Richard Hill, who's a First Nations curator at the Vancouver Art Gallery, had been John Scott's student and a very good friend of his, and writes sort of a memoir of his relationship to John Scott, which is extremely valuable, and it's just lovely to have that in the book. And then my old friend Robert Jacobs, Bo Jacobs, who's worked for many years at the Hiroshima Peace Institute, heads research at the Hiroshima Peace Institute, has written, I think, a brilliant letter pointing out that we are all walking versions of the Cold War. We all have radioactive particles in our bones. How do you date paintings? Pre-1945, post-1945. Everything pre-1945 doesn't have any particles and radioactive material in them. Everything after 1945 does. Doesn't matter whether something's exploding or not. The particles are circling in our world, and they are in us, and they are in everything. And he writes about much more than that, but that's one of the things he talks about very engagingly. So that's the book, and I couldn't be happier with it.
Yeah, well, we were so proud to publish it. It was so, the whole process of making this exhibition has been such a joy. So you won't be surprised to hear them already hounding John on what he's going to do next at the McMichael. So hopefully it won't take us 7 years to get there. This was a long, slow burn. But we had to find the right moment. And boy, we didn't know it was going to be this much of a right moment. That was weird. But we also, there's another reason it's the right time, which is that we're about to open two exhibitions, other exhibitions related to drawing. One, a Toronto artist named Derek Sullivan that will be opening in February, who's a fabulous mid-career artist in Toronto, excellent draftsman. And then also a large, sort of epic dive into our Cape Dorset King 8 collection of 90,000 drawings that we hold here at the McMichael, which we've just finished digitizing last summer. Thank you, Jen Withrow, for your persistence. She would not say die. And we worked with Ed Bertinsky and photographed the entire archive. It's now available on our website. But our new Indigenous curator of art and culture, Emily Henderson, has done a deep dive into this and is going to be presenting her findings, using the archive as a kind of social history of this transformation in Inuit life, from life on the land through to contemporary life, but through these drawings. So it's a big moment for the hand at the McMichael and drawing. And this is just the perfect context for a show like this. But then, of course, historically, as we've said, it's also an eerily perfect moment for us to be showing this work and talking about the issues that it raises. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. That was